Let's talk about the books I DNF'd this year. For those of you who don't know, DNF essentially just means I did not finish the book. I put it down, I decided it wasn't for me, and I don't plan on coming back to it. In the past, I've had trouble DNFing books. No matter what, I feel like I might as well finish. But in 2020, I decided that I wanted to be a bit better about just accepting that the book isn't for me and moving on to something else. That way I could avoid being put in a reading slump. And I actually ended up DNFing quite a few books this year, so let's get into it. One of the books I got the farthest into before DNFing was Consequences by Aleatha Romig. This is a dark romance that centers around a girl who is kidnapped by this very rich dude. She wakes up in his mansion and doesn't know what's going on. He gives her a list of rules that she has to follow, essentially, and she struggles to accept this new life. She's known as a very dark romance author. She really goes there usually. She's one of the first authors I ever came across when I was looking into dark taboo romances. And that was years and years ago. And I always did remember the book I read by her because it had a twist ending, and I think that's partially what she's known for. I DNF'd this at 56%. I started reading it as an ebook. I got probably 20% of the way in and decided to pick it up as an audiobook. And then I got to the 56% mark and decided I just couldn't do it anymore. I was just so bored. And the thing about this book that I just couldn't get into is the writing was just so dry, and the characters didn't really have any personality. It almost felt like the author was just writing in a very formal way instead of an emotional way, and I just couldn't find myself connecting to the characters or their situation at all. I don't ever plan on going back to this, it just wasn't for me. The next book I DNF'd was Violent Ends. This is an anthology book with a bunch of different writers, but I believe it was edited and kind of curated by Sean David Hutchison. This was an anthology about a school shooting in which each chapter and each short story was from a different character's perspective that is somehow connected to the shooting in some way. I've always found the subject and the media surrounding the school shooting to be very interesting because, of course, I can't imagine what would drive someone to do something so horrendous. And obviously there's just this extra layer of awful when it's happening to kids who are just so young. I think the problem with a lot of the depictions around school shootings is that they very much fall into a cliche sort of category. You see the same stories over and over again about the boys who are bullied and the popular girls who treat them poorly. And eventually none of it really feels true to life because it all just feels very shallow and surface level. I read about 26% of this, and that's very much how I felt about this collection. Because I only read 26%, I probably only read the first 5 short stories or so, but they all just felt very much like things I'd seen before. It didn't seem like they were diving any deeper or saying anything new. So even though this is a topic that interests me, it's just not something I'm going to be going back to. The next thing I DNF'd was Shit Actually by Lindy West. I listened to this on audiobook that I borrowed from the library. This is a compilation of essays by the author Lindy West. I don't really know much about Lindy West. I know that she has other books out, but I've never read those, so this was the first thing I picked up by her, and this was very much a look at pop culture and different essays that she wrote about movies and such. Unfortunately, I could not get into this. I only listened to 15% of it, and I just couldn't mesh with her comedy. The things that she was saying, I didn't find that funny. And there was a really uncomfortable essay on Forrest Gump where she spent a lot of it trying to imitate his voice, and the entire thing just made me feel icky, and so I just ended up returning it to the library, and I'm not going back to it, though I may pick up something from her in the future. The next thing I DNF'd was Heart-Shaped Box by Joe Hill. I love Lock and Key by Joe Hill, which is a comic series he did years and years ago, but I'd never picked up any of his books. I've been trying to get into horror, so I want to try something by him because I know that he's somewhat of a big name in the horror industry. This is a story about a guy who receives a haunted suit, I believe. I DNF'd this quite a while ago, so I don't remember it exactly, but I listened to it on an audiobook, and I only listened to the first 20% before DNFing it. Mostly, I just found myself very bored. I've done this with his father, Stephen King, so many times that I could feel the same feelings towards his writing that I was having towards Stephen King in the past. I recognized those emotions, and so I just didn't want to do it to myself again. I've put myself through so many Stephen King books thinking that I I would eventually love them, and then I just found out time and time again that I was wrong, and so I kind of felt like I should just skip that part with Joe Hill and retain my happy memories of Lock and Key and not try finishing and not try putting myself through a heart-shaped box entirely. He is an author that I'm willing to go back to because, like I said, I love Lock and Key so much, and I believe Heart-Shaped Box was his first novel, so maybe so I'm kind of hoping that maybe it's his weakest one and that I will enjoy some of his other stuff. The next thing I DNF'd was City of the Lost by Kelley Armstrong. This book frustrated me to no end because I loved the first part of it. This is a crime story following a detective, which, as we know, if you've watched any of my videos, you probably know that I really like detective stories. This one started off so strong. I was immediately hooked. I immediately liked her character, and it's not that she was so different from any other detective character, but the writer just had a really good way of making me feel with her. She also had kind of a messed up background and a messed up history and some things she did that were maybe not so good, and I really connected with that storyline as well. And I liked where it was going a lot. I also was super invested very quickly in her romantic entanglement that she was involved in. I was so on board to see where that relationship went. And then I got to about the 25% mark and everything changed. Basically, because of what the character had done and part of her backstory, she had to go into witness protection. She had a friend of hers that also needed to go in witness protection. Basically, her backstory ended up with her and a friend of hers having to go in witness protection. They had to move to this tiny town in the middle of fucking nowhere, and she was going to be one of the new detectives in this town. So say goodbye to that relationship I enjoy because it's never coming back. Once we got to that tiny town, my interest greatly diminished. The town itself was very quirky and cute, and that's just not something that I'm really into. It gave me more cozy vibes than it did hardcore mystery like it was giving me in the first part, and so I just wasn't at all interested. Not to mention that it was clear that the new love interest was going to be one of the cops she was working with, which I also didn't care about. I don't know if this is necessarily a case of, oh, this book was so bad and I could never enjoy this, as much as it was just a huge case of disappointment because I went from really loving it to not being nearly as interested. So I might try this one again at some point, but I don't know. I DNF'd this one at 30%. The next book I DNF'd was The Ritual by Adam Neville. This book frustrated me too because I thought I was gonna love it. This is a horror novel about a group of guys who go on a boys' weekend, and they go hitchhiking in the woods, and essentially they get lost and a bunch of things go wrong and things start to get creepy. Think Blair Witch Project sort of situation. I DNF'd this at 12%. When I read the first chapter, I was really interested, I was pretty excited, but it got really irritating really quickly. These guys, who are adult men by the way, are all awful people that you can't for the life of you figure out why any of them would want to be near each other. Because it's very clear that they hate each other. Once upon a time they might have been friends, but they clearly aren't anymore. And it was just so grating to have to listen to the way they talk to each other. I could have got past that. I would have gladly stuck around through their shitty behavior to get to the ooey gooey horror-y goodness in the middle, but this book was so fatphobic, it blew my mind, because that's not something I'm super sensitive to. It's something that I don't like, but it's not enough to make me throw down a book. But it was on every page. Every single page. He had to point out how fat one of the characters were, or he had to have one of the characters make a shitty comment about this other character's fatness. And it was just so irritating. There was no way for me to get past it. There was no way, because beyond just being offensive, it was just so fucking irritating. So I DNF'd that at 12%. There's no way in hell I'm going back to that. I also watched the movie. It also sucked. People said it was good, and don't get me wrong, it was better than the book, but yeah, no, don't put yourself through it. It's not worth it. The next book I DNF'd was I Let You Go by Clare MacKintosh. This is a thriller crime novel about a boy who was killed. and they are trying to figure out who did it. And it's from two different perspectives, one being the detectives, another being this woman. And the problem for me really just the problem with this one for me, it just comes down to the fact that it was so boring. I didn't connect to the characters at all. I didn't care about the storyline. There just wasn't anything interesting in this to get me to continue on. I'd heard some things about this. I'd heard some like really rave reviews, and I knew that there was some amazing twist. But the problem is, if you say that there's an amazing twist, then your brain automatically starts thinking, what could this amazing twist be? And so of course, I figured out pretty early on what the twist was gonna be. After I decided to DNF, I looked forward to see if I was right. I was. And while I actually think the second half of the book was probably way more interesting, I just can't get there through the first half of the book because I just hated it so much. Maybe I will pick this up on audiobook and get through that first part and then read the second part as a book, but I just don't know. The first part was so boring. These characters, I just didn't care about them at all. I DNF'd that at 30%. The next book I DNF'd was Dark Fairy Tales, which is an erotica anthology inspired by different fairy tales. So this is kind of where I realized that I'm just not into anthologies. I wanted to try them out because I really have always thought I wasn't gonna like anthologies, but you never know until you try. Turns out I was right. Short stories just don't do it for me. I only got 10% of the way into this. I really don't have a lot to say about it. Anthologies aren't for me. If ever there was gonna be one that would be for me, it would be this dark romance erotica, but can't do it. The next thing I DNF'd was Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Machado. This is a short story collection all by one author, which I thought, once again, maybe that would work more for me because if I vibed with her writing, then I would probably like all the short stories. But mostly I picked this up because I heard that there was a Law and Order inspired short story in here and that it was amazing. But I still wanted to read the rest of the book too. I actually enjoyed the first couple stories. I thought they were pretty decent and I enjoyed her writing a lot. I think it's very evocative. But then I got to the Law and Order storyline, but then I got to the Law and Order story that I was really looking forward to, and I hated it. I don't understand it whatsoever. It was kind of just synopsises. It was kind of just an episode guide, but with like alternative episodes that she made up, and I just don't get it. Clearly it went over my head because I didn't understand it at all, and as someone who loves Law & Order, I'm actually currently rewatching Law & Order SVU. It just didn't do anything for me. I'm still gonna read other books by her. Once again, short stories aren't for me, and this one didn't do it for me. I DNF'd it at 50%. The next thing I DNF'd was Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Obviously, this has been making the rounds on BookTube. Again, it's a classic, so it was obviously already extremely popular, but because of the new adaptation of the movie, I feel like it's made a resurgence. I love the trailer to the movie. I have watched it so many times. Every single time I watch it, it never fails to make me tear up. And so I'm really been looking forward to watching the movie, but I wanted to read the book first. I was really enjoying it at first. It's very comforting. It's very twee, very quaint. It's got very like cozy, homey, family feels. And so I was really liking it at first. But unfortunately that only gets me so far because after a while I get sick of comforting things because that's just not really my jam. Or I'm very much a dark romance reader or horror reader. I like a hard-hitting contemporary reader. I like things to be as dark as they can. So trying to read something like this just doesn't really do it for me for too long of a period. So while I was enjoying it at first, I just got kind of sick of it after the first 20%, so I ended up DNFing it at 21%. I don't know if I'll go back to it. I'd like to maybe try and chip away at it, but that's what I was doing back then, and clearly it didn't work out. The next thing I DNF'd was The Stranger Beside Me by Anne Rule. I recently listened to the entirety of My Favorite Murder over the course of like 3 or 4 months during quarantine, and they talked quite a few times about The Stranger Beside Me by Anne Rule, and so I decided to pick it up as an audiobook, and I just found it a little boring. The Stranger Beside Me is essentially about Anne Rule, the author's relationship with Ted Bundy. I thought that maybe I was gonna push through and try and listen to it again, but then I heard somebody else say that like she really goes kind of easy on him because she had such a personal relationship with him, and so I don't know, I'm just not interested in it. I love true crime podcasts and I'd rather just keep listening to those. I DNF'd that at 15%. The next thing I DNF'd was The Fact of a Body by Alexandria Marzano-Lesnevich. This is a memoir of a woman who, I believe she was a lawyer, and it's told in two parts but kind of alternating. The one section is very much about her life and her childhood and just everything leading up to where she ends up. And then the other half is this case that she's working on that involves a guy who I believe was a pedophile and a murderer. I DNF'd this at 50%. I was listening to it as an audiobook, and so clearly I got quite a while into it, but I just realized at a certain point that it wasn't really doing anything for me. I wasn't retaining any of the information. Like I said, I'm a huge lover of true crime, and so if this was just about the case, I probably would have been more interested in it, but I'm not really a lover of memoirs traditionally. So while her life was definitely interesting, it just wasn't necessarily the book for me. The next book I DNF'd was Hate by Tate James. I randomly picked this audiobook up on Audible Escape back when that was still a thing. I needed something to listen to. This seemed up my alley, so I just hit play and did whatever I was doing. This was about a girl who gets caught at a party with some sort of drugs or something. I honestly can't remember. But she ends up going to prison for a while. Or, no, she ends up going to trial and losing like different parts of her life or something. She ends up getting framed for some sort of criminal activity by this group of guys. When she gets back, she finds out that her dad is married to the boy's mom or something, and so now she has to like live with these dudes. I honestly don't remember. I DNF'd it at 30%, and that 30% I listened to all in one sitting. It didn't stick with me. I wasn't intrigued to find out what was gonna happen. I just didn't care, so I didn't keep reading it. That was as simple as that. And the last thing I DNF'd was Pray for the Girl by Joseph Souza. I was so looking forward to this. This was on my 19 books I wanted to read in 2019 video. This was also, I believe, in my 5-star predictions. I really was looking forward to this. Unfortunately, I didn't get very far. This is about a former soldier who comes back to her hometown and realizes that there is a big racial divide, especially when a young Muslim girl gets murdered. I thought that all sounded very interesting. I like the idea of social commentary on the racial divide that you often see now, the way people hate refugees for no fucking reason. So I was hoping that this would provide some good insight on that. Unfortunately, I just found that I could not get past the 8% mark. The way characters talk to each other was just so weird and so unrealistic. Every single time someone opened their mouth, I was like, that's not how people speak to each other. I just couldn't get past it. I really didn't like it. I hope that someday maybe I'll try again because I really wanted to like this one. But yeah, I DNF'd it at 8%, and that's not a good sign. So those are the books that I DNF'd in 2020. I'm pretty proud of myself that I've actually gotten the hang of this DNF thing. But hopefully I'll pick up books this year that I won't want to put down. Thanks for watching this video, and I hope you'll come back in soon. Bye.